Talrek had observed 12 different species in combat over his 40-year career. He considered himself an expert on military doctrine, tactical efficiency, and the civilized conduct of war. The Galactic Coalition had perfected warfare over 3 centuries. Battles were calculated affairs with clear rules. When one side suffered 15% casualties, they surrendered. When civilian populations were threatened, both sides paused for evacuation. War was a political tool, not a barbaric practice. That was before he met the humans. The assignment seemed routine when it arrived. The Coalition needed observers embedded with the newest member species during their first major conflict. Humanity had joined the galactic community only 5 years ago, and their military capabilities remained largely unknown. They had small ships, limited technology, and their soldiers looked fragile compared to the muscular Veltari or the armored Kreth. Talrek accepted the assignment, expecting to file a brief report about humanity's inevitable request for support from more experienced Coalition forces. The briefing room on Station Triumph held representatives from 6 Coalition species. Talrek noticed the human delegation immediately. They sat quietly in standard military uniforms, their soft skin unprotected by natural armor or thick hide. Captain J1 led the human group. He was tall for his species, with dark hair cut short and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. He moved with economy, wasting no energy on unnecessary gestures. The tactical display showed the problem clearly. The Krevtar swarm had emerged from uncharted space 3 months ago. They ignored all diplomatic channels. They attacked without warning and fought without mercy. Their hive mind coordination made them devastatingly effective. They had already consumed 4 minor colonies, stripping them of all biological matter before moving on. Now they approached Praxis 7, a thriving colony world home to 250,000 civilians from a dozen Coalition species. The Coalition fleet had assembled to defend the planet, but intelligence suggested the Krevtar outnumbered them 3 to 1. The Coalition admiral, a 4-armed Kreth named Kelvar, reviewed the defensive strategy. It followed standard doctrine perfectly. Fleet assets would engage the Krevtar at maximum range. Ground forces would establish defensive perimeters around major population centers. If casualties exceeded 12%, forces would execute a fighting retreat while civilians evacuated to prepared transports. The entire operation was designed to minimize losses while buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Captain J1 raised his hand. His voice was quiet but carried clearly across the room. What happens if they break through the defensive line before evacuation completes? Admiral Kelvar's translator conveyed mild confusion. Then we fall back to secondary positions and continue evacuation. And if they break through secondary positions? J1 asked. We retreat to orbit and defend the evacuation ships. How many civilians die in that scenario? The room fell silent. Admiral Kelvar consulted his tactical computer. Estimates suggest 40 to 60,000 would not reach the transports in time. J1 nodded slowly. Then we need to hold the primary line. No retreat. Several Coalition representatives objected immediately. Such tactics were suicidal. Defensive positions could not hold against a 3 to 1 numerical advantage. The casualties would be catastrophic. J1 listened patiently to each objection. Then he spoke again, and Talrek heard something in his voice that made his scales prickle with instinctive unease. We'll hold the line, J1 repeated. Human forces request assignment to the most vulnerable positions. We'll anchor the defense. Admiral Kelvar tried to explain that human forces, being so new to Coalition military standards, should take supporting positions. Frontline duty against the Krevtar was a death sentence. We understand, J1 said simply. We'll hold anyway. That was when Talrek began to suspect that humans might be very different from other Coalition species. The journey to Praxis 7 took 4 days. Talrek spent most of that time with the human soldiers observing their preparations. He met Corporal Hana, a compact woman with scarred hands who spoke about explosive compounds with disturbing enthusiasm. Private Minho was barely old enough to be considered an adult by human standards, yet he cleaned his weapon with the focus of a master craftsman. What struck Talrek most was their behavior. They joked constantly. They played strange games with cards and dice. They showed each other images of their families. They seemed utterly unconcerned about the coming battle. He asked Minho about it one evening. The young soldier shrugged. Fear doesn't help. The fight's coming whether we're scared or not. But you know the odds, Thalrek pressed. Coalition projections show human forces will likely suffer 40% casualties in the first engagement alone. Minho looked at him with eyes that seemed much older than his face. Then 4 out of 10 of us won't go home. But 6 will. And those 250,000 people down there, they all go home. That's the job, Thalrek didn't understand. No other species calculated sacrifice so casually. They landed on Praxis 7 under a violet sky. The colony sprawled across a temperate valley, buildings of dozens of architectural styles reflecting its multicultural population. Human forces immediately began fortifying positions along the northern ridge, where the Krevtar would likely attack. Thalrek watched them work with brutal efficiency. They dug trenches, positioned weapons, and created overlapping fields of fire. Captain Jaewon walked the line constantly, checking every position personally. He knew every soldier's name. He shared meals with them. He listened to their concerns. But when he gave orders, there was no question of disobedience. These humans respected him in a way Thalrek had rarely seen in coalition forces. The Krevtar arrived on the 7th day. The sky darkened with their landing craft. Thousands of them. They descended like a plague, blotting out the sun. The ground trembled as they landed beyond the ridge. Sensors showed the Krevtar massing for assault. Their numbers exceeded worst-case projections. Coalition. Forces prepared to execute defensive. Protocol 7. Human forces simply checked their weapons and waited. Thalrek positioned himself at the human command post. He wanted to observe their tactics firsthand. Captain Jaewon stood calmly watching the tactical display. The Krevtar began their advance. "Here they come," Jaewon said quietly. Then he opened the command channel. "All units, this is Ironside Actual. Remember why we're here. Remember who we're protecting. The line holds, no matter what. No retreat, no surrender. Hold the line." The response came from dozens of human soldiers across the defensive positions. They didn't acknowledge orders formally. They simply said in voices that ranged from grim to eager, "We hold." Thalrek checked his recording equipment one final time. He expected to document a brave but ultimately futile stand before coalition protocols forced a retreat. He had no idea he was about to witness something the galaxy had never seen before. The Krevtar crested the ridge like a living wave, thousands of them, insect-like bodies moving in perfect coordination. They came without fear, without hesitation, without mercy. The humans opened fire. Thalrek watched as Captain Jaewon stood exposed on the command post, calmly calling firing solutions while weapons fired toward the air around him. He watched Corporal Hana laugh as she triggered demolitions that vaporized entire Krevtar formations. He watched Private Minho fire with mechanical precision, his young face completely expressionless. The humans weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting to kill. And for the first time in his long career, Thalrek felt something he had never experienced while observing warfare. He felt afraid. The battle lasted 18 hours without pause. Thalrek had studied warfare across the galaxy. He understood tactics, logistics, and the mathematical certainty of attrition. What he witnessed on that ridge broke every rule he knew. The humans fought like nothing he had ever seen. Coalition doctrine emphasized preservation of forces. When a position became untenable, you retreated to prepared fallback points. When casualties reached critical levels, you requested relief. When the enemy achieved numerical superiority, you yielded ground and regrouped. These were the foundations of civilized warfare. The humans ignored every principle. The first Krevtar wave hit the northern trench line with overwhelming force. Standard protocol called for a measured retreat to secondary positions. Instead, Captain Jaewon ordered his soldiers to hold. Not to delay, not to slow the enemy advance, to hold completely. Thalrek watched through his observation equipment as human soldiers fired until their weapons overheated, then fired some more. When a section of trench began to collapse under Krevtar assault, Corporal Hana ran toward it carrying explosive charges. She didn't run to escape. She ran toward the danger. "What is she doing?" Thalrek asked the communications officer, a young human named Sung Ho. "Her job," Sung Ho replied, his attention fixed on the tactical display. Hana reached the collapsing trench and dropped into it. Seconds later, the entire section exploded. Krevtar bodies flew through the air. When the smoke cleared, Hana emerged from a crater, her armor scorched, her face bleeding. She was smiling. The northern line held. By hour 4, human casualties reached 20%. Coalition forces would have retreated. Admiral Kelvar contacted Captain Jawan directly, ordering him to fall back to prepared secondary positions. Jawan refused. Negative, Admiral. If we give them this ridge, they'll have direct firing lines to the evacuation zones. Civilians are still loading on transports. We hold until they're safe. Captain, you'll lose half your forces defending that position. Then we lose half. But the civilians get out. Ironside holds. The channel went silent. Admiral Kelvar had no response to such logic. In coalition thinking, losing half your forces to save civilians was an unacceptable exchange. Better to save the soldiers and evacuate what civilians you could, but humans calculated differently. Thalrek began to understand something terrible. These humans didn't value their own lives more than those they protected. Every other species he knew operated on self-preservation first. Soldiers fought to survive. They protected civilians when possible, but not at the cost of military collapse. Humans inverted that priority completely. Private Minho held position 17, an exposed gun emplacement on the eastern slope. Sensors showed Krevtar forces concentrating for a breakthrough at his location. Standard doctrine said to abandon the position before being overrun. Minho requested more ammunition. Thalrek watched the young human fire with mechanical efficiency. His weapon systems overheated twice. He switched to backup weapons. When those ran dry, he used sidearms. Krevtar bodies piled in front of his position. They came in hundreds. He killed them in hundreds. A Krevtar blade caught him across the chest, tearing through armor. Blood splashed across his weapon. Minho didn't stop firing. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, they would break through. If they broke through, they would reach the civilians. So he didn't stop. When reinforcements finally reached position 17, they found Minho unconscious from blood loss, collapsed over his weapon. The gun was empty. The approach was covered in Krevtar dead. He had held for 6 hours alone. They carried him to medical facilities. The doctors said he would survive. When he woke 3 days later, his first question was whether the line had held. It had. But the cost horrified Thalrek. He walked the defensive positions after the first major assault ended. Human soldiers sat in trenches covered in blood and dirt. Some were wounded. All were exhausted. They cleaned weapons, shared water, and prepared for the next wave. They weren't celebrating survival. They were preparing to fight again. Thalrek found Corporal Hanna checking demolition charges for the 3rd defensive line. She had burns across her arms and a field bandage wrapped around her head. Why? He asked her. Why do you fight like this? Your casualties are catastrophic. Hanna looked at him with eyes that held something Thalrek couldn't identify. Not madness, not even courage. Something else entirely. Because someone has to, she said simply. Those people down in the evacuation zones? They have families, children, lives. If we run, they die. We're soldiers. This is what we do. But you're dying, Thalrek insisted. 26% casualties already. By tomorrow, it could be 40%. You're destroying yourselves, Hanna nodded. Maybe, but we're taking them with us. And every hour we hold is another hour for evacuation. That's worth it. Worth dying for. Worth fighting for. There's a difference. She returned to her work, dismissing him. Thalrek retreated to the command post, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Captain Jawan stood at the tactical display, planning the defense for the next assault. He looked exhausted but focused. Captain, may I speak freely? Thalrek asked. Jawan nodded without looking away from the display. Your tactics are suicidal. You're spending lives like they have no value. Now Jawan looked at him. His expression wasn't angry. It was patient, like a teacher explaining something to a student. We value every life here, Jawan said quietly. That's exactly why we fight this way. Those 250,000 civilians down there, their lives have value. My soldiers know their own lives have value. That's why they're willing to spend them protecting others, because some things are worth dying for. What things? Thalrek demanded. Everything that matters. Jawan turned back to the display. The next wave hits in 4 hours. You should rest while you can. Thalrek couldn't rest. He spent those hours reviewing his recordings, trying to understand. He watched human soldiers write messages to their families. He watched them share photographs and memories. He watched them prepare to die for people they had never met. The second wave hit at dawn. This time, the Krevtar adapted. They focused their assault on weak points. They used the bodies of their dead as shields. They came with greater numbers and better coordination. The humans adapted too. Captain J1 abandoned defensive doctrine entirely. When the Krevtar concentrated forces for a breakthrough, he ordered counterattacks. Human soldiers charged out of their protected positions into enemy formations. They carried demolition charges and close combat weapons. They fought with a ferocity that shocked even the Krevtar. Thalrek watched Corporal Hana lead a squad directly into a Krevtar concentration point. They disappeared into the mass of enemies. Explosions followed. When the smoke cleared, the Krevtar breakthrough had collapsed. Only 3 humans emerged from that assault. Hana was one of them. She was missing part of her left arm. She refused evacuation. She could still fight one-handed, she said. They needed everyone. By hour 16, human casualties reached 40%. Coalition forces had pulled back to orbital positions, unable to sustain their own losses. Only the humans remained on the line. But the line held. The evacuation transports launched with all 250,000 civilians safely aboard. The mission was successful. The humans had won, at a cost that made Thalrek's recording equipment feel obscene. He was documenting something that shouldn't exist. Soldiers who willingly destroyed themselves to protect others. Warriors who measured victory not in survival, but in duty fulfilled. Captain J1 stood on the ridge, watching the evacuation ships rise into the sky. His uniform was torn and bloody. Half his command was dead or wounded. He smiled. "We held," he said quietly. Thalrek realized he was watching something the galaxy had never produced before. Not soldiers, not warriors. Guardians. And he understood with growing horror what that meant for anyone who threatened what humans chose to protect. The civilians were safe, but the battle was far from over. The Krevtar didn't retreat after the failed assault. Instead, they did something that violated all tactical logic. They surrounded the human positions completely. Thousands more of them arrived from orbit, landing in waves behind the defensive line. Within 6 hours, the humans went from defenders to besieged. Coalition command ordered immediate evacuation. The battle was won. The civilians were safe. There was no reason to sacrifice more soldiers. Captain J1 refused the order. Thalrek listened to the command channel argument with growing disbelief. Admiral Kelvar was practically begging the human captain to withdraw his forces. "Captain, your mission is complete. Fall back to the landing zones. We'll provide cover fire from orbit." "Negative, Admiral." J1's voice was calm despite the weapons fire audible in the background. "The Krevtar have forces between us and the landing zones. If we withdraw, they'll pursue. We can't risk leading them to any remaining civilians or recovery. Teams then will bombard the area between your position and the landing zones. Orbital strikes will take 12 minutes to authorize and execute. The Krevtar can cover that distance in 8. We stay put. We can hold this position. You'll be cut off completely. No supplies, no reinforcements, no evacuation route." "Understood. Ironside will hold until the situation changes." J1 out. He cut the channel before the Admiral could respond. Thalrek stared at the human captain. "You just refused a direct order from Coalition Command." J1 nodded, studying the tactical display. "I did. They could court-martial you, strip your rank, imprison you. If I survive long enough for that to matter, I'll accept whatever consequences come." He looked at Thalrek. "Right now I have soldiers to keep alive and enemies to kill. Everything else is a problem for later." The human forces dug in. They had 3 days of supplies if they rationed carefully. Medical supplies were already running low after 40% casualties. Ammunition was sufficient for perhaps 2 more major assaults. The Krevtar launched 4 assaults in the next 24 hours. Thalrek watched the humans fight with resources that would have forced any coalition unit to surrender. They ran out of medical supplies and used improvised bandages. They ran low on ammunition and made every shot count. They were exhausted, wounded, and surrounded. They kept fighting. On the second day of siege, Thalrek was trapped in a collapsed observation post when Krevtar forces broke through the eastern perimeter. The structure fell around him, pinning his legs under debris. He called for help, but the command channel was chaos. Everyone was engaged. Then someone was there, lifting the debris. Corporal Hana, her left arm still bandaged, using her remaining arm to drag him free. She pulled him toward the command bunker while weapons fire tore the air around them. Why? Thalrek gasped as they took cover. Why risk yourself for me? Hana reloaded her weapon one-handed, a feat that should have been impossible. Because you're here. That makes you one of ours. We don't leave our people behind. She returned to the firing line. Thalrek remained in the bunker, his entire worldview crumbling. This human had risked her life to save an alien observer who contributed nothing to their survival. It made no tactical sense. It made no evolutionary sense, but it was completely human. That night, Thalrek sat with the remaining soldiers. They numbered fewer than 60 now. They shared the last of their rations in silence. Private Minho was there, recovered enough to return to duty despite medical advice. His chest was wrapped in bandages, but his hands were steady on his weapon. Do you want to die here? Thalrek asked him. Minho considered the question seriously. No, I want to live. I want to go home, see my family, live a normal life. Then why stay? Why not try to break out? Because breaking out means running. Running means leading the Krevtar to people we're supposed to protect. I want to live, but I want it the right way, not by abandoning what matters. Another soldier, a woman named Unji, laughed bitterly. We're not heroes, observer. We're just people who are more afraid of living with failure than dying with purpose. Captain Jaewon joined them, sitting on the bunker floor like any other soldier. His rank meant nothing here. They were all just people trying to survive the night. Tell me about your world, Jaewon said to Thalrek. Your people? What are they like? Thalrek described the Veltari homeworld. Beautiful crystal cities. Advanced technology. Peaceful society. 3 centuries without major conflict. They had evolved beyond primitive violence. Jaewon listened carefully. Sounds nice, safe. It is. We learn to solve problems without warfare. What happens when someone threatens your cities? Your people? We use coalition forces. We negotiate. We find peaceful solutions. And if negotiation fails? If the enemy won't talk? Thalrek hesitated. We've never faced that situation. There's always a peaceful solution if you look hard enough. Jaewon nodded slowly. That's good, really. I hope you never have to learn different. He stood, preparing to inspect the defensive positions again. But if you do, I hope you have humans nearby. Because we learned a long time ago that sometimes there is no peaceful solution. Sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and darkness is people willing to become darkness themselves. On the 3rd day, Coalition Command authorized a rescue operation. They would create a corridor with orbital bombardment, allowing human forces to evacuate. It would be risky, but possible. Jaewon refused again. The bombardment will kill our wounded. We have 30 soldiers who can't move without assistance. We don't leave our wounded behind. Then wait for ground extraction teams, Admiral Kelvar pleaded. Ground teams will take 6 hours to reach us. We have Krevtar forces preparing for another assault in 2 hours. We need the orbital strike now on their staging areas, not on an evacuation corridor. Help us kill them, and we'll walk out on our own. The Admiral reluctantly agreed. Thalrek watched as Captain Jaewon coordinated with orbital assets. He wasn't planning defense anymore. He was planning annihilation. The orbital strikes would hit Krevtar concentrations, and the moment they landed, human forces would attack into the confusion. You're going to attack? Thalrek asked in disbelief. You're surrounded, outnumbered, and low on supplies. Standard doctrine says to defend and wait for relief. Jaewon checked his weapon with practiced efficiency. Standard doctrine is for people trying to survive. We're trying to win. There's a difference. The orbital strikes hit like thunder. The ground shook. Krevtar staging areas disappeared in fire. The humans attacked. 60 soldiers charged into thousands of enemies. They moved like a single organism, covering each other, coordinating fire, pushing forward without hesitation. Thalrek watched from the command bunker, recording everything, his hands shaking. This wasn't warfare as he understood it. This was something primal, something that had no place in civilized society. This was humanity showing what they really were. Captain Jaewon led from the front, his weapon cutting down Krevtar with mechanical precision. Corporal Hana moved beside him, throwing demolition charges with her remaining arm. Private Minho covered their advance, his young face transformed into something cold and efficient. They weren't fighting to survive anymore. They were hunting. The Krevtar broke. For the first time in the entire conflict, the hive mind species retreated. They fled from 60 humans who refused to die. The siege was over. But Thalrek's horror was just beginning. He had seen what humans became when cornered. He had witnessed them transform from laughing soldiers into efficient killers. He had watched them cross a line that separated civilization from savagery, and the worst part was understanding that they could cross back. They could be monsters and then return to being people. They contained both natures simultaneously. That realization terrified him more than any weapon in the galaxy. The siege was broken, but the war was far from over. Human reinforcements arrived within 30 hours. The 7th Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Praxis 7 system, bringing 3,000 more soldiers and enough firepower to level a continent. Admiral Kyung-soo commanded the fleet personally, and Thalrek watched the veteran officer coordinate his forces with cold efficiency. The Krevtar had withdrawn to the planet's southern hemisphere, regrouping for another assault. Coalition intelligence estimated their numbers at over 40,000. Standard doctrine called for containment and negotiation. Admiral Kelvar proposed surrounding the Krevtar position and broadcasting surrender terms. Admiral Kyung-soo had different plans. Thalrek attended the command briefing in the orbital station. Captain Jae-won was there, his uniform clean now but his face showing the strain of the siege. Corporal Hana stood beside him, her left arm replaced by a temporary prosthetic. Private Minho had recovered enough to return to duty, though he moved carefully to protect his healing chest. Admiral Kyung-soo studied the tactical display with an expression Thalrek couldn't read. Then he did something unprecedented. He opened a direct communication channel to the Krevtar. "This is Admiral Kyung-soo of the Human Defense Force. You have attacked a coalition world and killed coalition citizens. You have 1 hour to withdraw your forces from this system. If you remain, we will consider it a declaration of total war. This is your only warning." The response came in the form of a video transmission. Krevtar warriors stood in formation, and between them hung the bodies of human prisoners, 20 soldiers captured during the initial assault. The Krevtar executioner moved down the line, killing them one by one. The transmission ended. Admiral Kyung-soo's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once and closed the channel. Then he turned to his command staff. "All forces, prepare for offensive operations. Rules of engagement are now unrestricted. No quarter will be given. No surrender will be accepted. We will prosecute this war until the Krevtar are eliminated completely from this system. Execute Protocol Omega." Thalrek's translator struggled with the unfamiliar military term. "What is Protocol Omega?" Captain Jae-won answered, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Thalrek's scales prickle. "Total war. We stop being soldiers and become exterminators." The transformation was immediate and absolute. Coalition forces operated under strict engagement rules. Minimize civilian casualties. Avoid cultural sites. Accept surrenders. Treat prisoners humanely. These were the foundations of civilized warfare. Humans discarded all of them. The first strike hit the Krevtar southern position with orbital bombardment that lasted 4 hours. Nothing survived. When the fire stopped, human ground forces advanced into the smoking ruins, hunting any survivors. They found hundreds hiding in underground tunnels. They sealed the tunnels and pumped them full of poison gas. Thalrek watched from reconnaissance drones, his recording equipment capturing everything. He wanted to look away. He couldn't. This was important. This was humanity showing what they really were when you pushed them past their breaking point. The Krevtar tried to flee. Their remaining ships launched from hidden positions, attempting to escape into space. The 7th Fleet was waiting, not just with weapons, but with anger. Human fighter craft pursued fleeing Krevtar ships across the system. They didn't just destroy them. They hunted them down one by one, making sure none escaped. Major Dae-hyun, commanding the fighter wing, coordinated the pursuit with ruthless efficiency. All targets must be confirmed destroyed. Visual confirmation required. No survivors. Thalrek listened to the tactical channels and heard humans laughing as they killed. Not from joy. From something darker. From release. They had been holding themselves back during the siege, fighting defensively, dying to protect others. Now they were free to show what they could do when protection became vengeance. Corporal Hana led ground forces in clearing operations. Her squad moved through Krevtar positions with mechanical efficiency. They weren't taking prisoners. When they found wounded Krevtar, they executed them quickly and moved on. Thalrek forced himself to observe one of these operations personally. He needed to understand. He found Hana's squad in the remains of a Krevtar command center. Bodies littered the floor. The surviving Krevtar had retreated into a sealed chamber. Hana placed demolition charges on the door. Thalrek stepped forward. They're trapped. They can't harm anyone. Why not just leave them? Hana looked at him with eyes that held no warmth. Because they killed my friends. They executed prisoners. They chose to fight without mercy. Now they learn what that actually means. But you're better than them. You're civilized. We are civilized. That's why we tried diplomacy first. That's why we offered them a chance to leave. They chose this. They wanted to see what humans become when you hurt us. Now they get to see. She triggered the charges. The explosion was deafening. That night, Thalrek couldn't file his report. His hands shook too badly. He had witnessed atrocities. Not by the Krevtar, by the humans. The species that wrote poetry and made art and loved their families. The same species that was systematically exterminating an enemy without mercy. Private Minho found him in the observation deck, staring at the planet below. Fires marked where human forces were still clearing Krevtar positions. You think we're monsters, Minho said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what you are, Thalrek admitted. Minho sat beside him. His chest wound still bothered him, but his expression was calm. We're people who understand something your species forgot. There are things in the universe that don't care about civilization. They don't want to negotiate. They only understand force, but the cruelty, the complete destruction, it's inhuman. It's exactly human. We're capable of great kindness and great cruelty. We choose kindness whenever we can. But when kindness fails, when mercy is taken as weakness, when someone threatens everything we love, we become what we need to be. Monsters. Guardians. There's a difference. Monsters enjoy the killing, we hate it, but we do it anyway because the alternative is letting monsters win. The ground campaign lasted 6 days. By the end, the Krevtar presence on Praxis 7 was completely eliminated. Not defeated. Not driven off. Eliminated. Every last one of them was dead. Human casualties during the offensive were minimal. Only 37 soldiers lost compared to over 40,000 Krevtar killed. Coalition Command studied the results with growing alarm. This kind of military efficiency was unprecedented and terrifying. Admiral Kyung-soo addressed the combined fleet before they departed. Thalrek recorded the speech, knowing it would be analyzed by every coalition military academy for years to come. What we did here was necessary. Not good, not noble, necessary. The Krevtar gave us no choice. They ignored diplomacy. They killed civilians. They executed prisoners. So we showed them what happens when you make humanity your enemy. We became their nightmare. We will always be ready to become that nightmare again if needed. He paused, looking directly at the camera that would broadcast this to the entire coalition. But let me be clear. This is not who we are. This is what we become when forced. We prefer peace. We choose cooperation. We believe in civilization and law. But we will never be victims. We will never let others slaughter the innocent. And we will never apologize for protecting what matters. Remember that. We are not warriors seeking glory. We are guardians who will become demons if that's what protecting our people requires. The speech ended. The fleet prepared to depart. The war was over. Thalrek spent his final night on Praxis 7 walking through the memorial garden the humans had constructed. They had built it before leaving, using local stone and native plants. 4,127 names were carved into black obsidian walls. Every human who died defending this world. At the center stood a statue, not of a warrior, not of a general, just a soldier, kneeling, holding the body of a civilian child. The inscription read, "We became monsters so they could remain innocent." Thalrek understood then. The humans weren't proud of what they had done. They were ashamed, but they would do it again without hesitation if required. That made them more terrifying than any species that killed without conscience, because humans knew exactly what they were doing. And they did it anyway. 20 years passed before Thalrek returned to Praxis 7. He was older now, his scales dulled with age, his movements slower. But his memory of those 43 days remained sharp. The images haunted him. The sounds. The smell of battle. The sight of humans becoming something terrible to protect something precious. He had spent 2 decades writing about it. His memoir, The Guardians: What I Learned About Humanity in 43 Days of Hell, became required reading in every coalition military academy. Not because it praised humanity, because it warned about them. The galaxy had changed in 20 years. The Krevtar were gone, hunted to extinction by human forces across a dozen systems. Other aggressive species had emerged, tested coalition borders, and quickly retreated when they learned humans were part of the defense force. Humanity had become the coalition's sword, the last resort, the monster in the closet that kept the galaxy safe, and Thalrek needed to understand if that was victory or tragedy. Praxis 7 had thrived. The colony now held 500,000 residents. New buildings rose beside old ones. Children played in parks that had once been battlefields. Life had returned to normal. Thalrek visited the memorial garden first. It had expanded. More names now. Humans who died in other battles, other worlds, other wars. But the original 4,127 names remained at the center, carved in obsidian that would last forever. He found Private Minho there. Except he wasn't private anymore. The insignia on his uniform marked him as colonel. He was older, lines around his eyes, his hair touched with gray. But his hands were steady, like always. Observer Thalrek, Minho said, recognizing him immediately. I wondered if you'd come back. I needed to see, to understand what it all meant. They walked through the garden together. Minho touched the wall of names occasionally, his fingers tracing letters. I think about them every day, Minho said quietly. My friends who died here. Captain J1, Corporal Hana, so many others. Hana died. Thalrek felt the loss, though he barely knew her. 5 years ago. Different battle, different world. She was saving civilians during an evacuation. A collapsing building. She got everyone out. He smiled sadly. She died doing exactly what she always did. Protecting others. They reached the center statue, the soldier holding the child. Flowers surrounded it. Fresh ones. Placed by colonists who remembered. Do you regret it? Thalrek asked. What you became during the war? Minho considered the question for a long time. I regret that it was necessary. I hate that we had to become killers. But do I regret protecting these people? Never. Look around. 500,000 lives. Families, children, dreams, all alive because we held the line. You killed 40,000 Krevtar. We did. And I remember everyone. Not individually, but as a weight. It doesn't go away. We carry it forever. That's the price. Is it worth it? Minho gestured to the city beyond the garden. Children were playing in a park. A young couple walked hand in hand. An old man sat on a bench feeding birds. Ask them, Minho said simply. Thalrek spent the next week interviewing colonists. He needed to complete his understanding. He spoke with families who had been evacuated. Children who had grown up in the peace humans purchased with blood. Artists who created beauty in spaces once marked by death. An elderly Veltari woman named Shenkel invited him to her home. She had been on Praxis 7 during the battle. She remembered. I was terrified, she said, serving him traditional tea. The Krevtar were coming. We all knew what that meant. We'd heard stories from other colonies. Everyone killed, everything destroyed. What do you remember about the humans? Her eyes grew distant. I remember a young soldier. He couldn't have been more than 20. He helped my family to the evacuation transport. I asked him if he was coming too. He said no. He had to stay, fight. I asked him why. Why risk his life for people he didn't know? She paused, hands trembling on her cup. He said, because you matter. All of you matter, and we're soldiers. This is what we do. Then he smiled at my grandson, gave him a small coin from his pocket as a good luck charm, and went back to the fighting line. I never saw him again, but we lived. My grandson is 40 now. He has children of his own, 3 generations alive because that boy chose to fight. She showed Thalrek the coin, worn smooth with decades of handling, kept as a treasure. Were the humans monsters? She asked. Maybe, but they were our monsters. They became terrible so we could be safe. I think about that soldier every day. I pray in my way that wherever he is, he knows it mattered. That we remember, that we're grateful. Thalrek visited the Coalition Military Academy next. He observed training exercises. They had changed significantly. Human doctrine was now standard teaching. Students from dozens of species learned human tactics, human strategies, human philosophy of warfare, but they struggled with it. A young Kreth officer named Telvan approached him after an exercise. "Observer, can I ask you something?" "Of course. I've studied the Battle of Praxis 7 extensively. The human tactics, the decisions. I understand the strategy, but I don't understand the mindset. How do they calculate that way? How do they accept those casualties?" Talrek looked at the young officer, remembering when he had asked the same questions. "They don't calculate differently. They prioritize differently. You were taught to preserve your forces. Humans were taught to preserve what their forces protect. The soldiers are the shield. The shield breaks so the thing behind it survives. But the shield is people, living beings with value. Yes, and they know that. They accept it anyway. That's what makes them terrifying. They understand the cost and pay it willingly." Telvan shook his head. "I don't think I could do that. Most species can't, that's why humans exist. To do what the rest of us cannot." On his final day, Thalrek returned to the memorial garden. He had a speech prepared. He had been invited to speak at the dedication of a new section of the memorial. Hundreds of people gathered, veterans, families, colonists, all there to remember. Thalrek stood before them, his prepared speech in hand. Then he set it aside. 20 years ago, I came to this world to observe human warfare. I was an expert, or so I thought. I had studied a dozen species. I understood tactics, strategy, logistics. I thought I understood war. He looked at the names on the wall. I understood nothing. Because warfare is not about tactics. It's about choice. Every species in the galaxy fights to survive. Only humans fight for something beyond themselves. They fight for an idea, the idea that some things matter more than survival. That protection is worth the price. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I called my memoir The Guardians because that's what humans are. Not warriors seeking glory, not conquerors seeking power. Guardians who stand between darkness and light. And when you stand in that position long enough, some of that darkness touches you, changes you. You become part of what you fight. Thalrek looked at Colonel Minho standing at attention with other veterans. I came here 20 years ago and witnessed horror. Not the horror of battle. The horror of watching people become monsters to protect others. Of watching them sacrifice everything while knowing exactly what they were doing. Of watching them carry wounds that would never heal, burdens that would never lift, because they chose to pay the price so others wouldn't have to. His voice cracked slightly. I learned that humanity is not one thing. They are not good or evil, peaceful or violent, merciful or cruel. They are all of those things simultaneously. They contain multitudes. They can write poetry about peace while perfecting the methods of war. They can love fiercely and kill efficiently. They can be your greatest friend or your worst nightmare, depending entirely on where you stand in relation to what they choose to protect. He looked at the statue, the soldier holding the child, 20 years ago. I asked if what happened here was victory or tragedy. I finally understand. It's both. Victory because 250,000 people lived, tragedy because 4,127 people died to make that possible. But humans don't calculate in abstractions. They look at each living face and say, worth it. They look at each fallen name and say, worth it. They carry both the joy and the sorrow, the pride and the shame, the light and the darkness. Thalrek placed his hand on the memorial wall. My species evolved past our violent nature 3 millennia ago. We became civilized. We forgot how to fight. We thought that made us better. But when the Krevter came, when real evil threatened, we couldn't stop them. We could only call for help. And humanity answered, not because they're less civilized, because they remember something we forgot. That civilization is not the absence of violence. It's the wisdom to use violence only in protection of life. It's the willingness to become darkness so others can live in light. He faced the crowd. I came here to observe humans in combat. I found horror. Not in what they did to their enemies, in what they were willing to do to themselves. They became monsters so we could remain innocent. They carried burdens so we could live free. They walked through darkness so we could see light. His voice strengthened. That is humanity. Not perfect, not always right, but always willing to pay the price for what matters. And that, more than any weapon or technology, is what makes them the most powerful force in the galaxy, because they fight not for conquest or glory,